The briefing room at Forward Operating Base Viper fell silent as Colonel Marcus Reed's voice cut through the morning haze of cigarette smoke and stale coffee. "Gentlemen, we have a situation." The word gentleman hung in the air like cordite after a firefight, deliberate and cutting. Captain Kira, Nightshade Voss shifted in her chair at the back of the room, her weathered flight suit bearing the faded patches of 3 combat deployments. She had been the first to arrive, as always, but now found herself relegated to the observer's gallery, while 12 male pilots received their orders for Operation Shadowfall. The mission parameters scrolled across the tactical display in harsh green light. A reconnaissance team had gone dark in the Kandahar Valley, their last transmission a desperate plea for immediate extraction. Intelligence suggested they were pinned down in a narrow canyon, surrounded by insurgent forces who knew the terrain better than anyone. The rescue window was closing fast, 18 hours before the team would either break cover or be overrun entirely. Reed's eyes swept the assembled pilots, landing briefly on Voss before moving away with practice dismissal. "This is a precision operation requiring our most experienced rotary wing assets." His voice carried the weight of command, but beneath it lay something else, a subtle tension that made the younger pilots shift uncomfortably. The target zone is a box canyon, approximately 2 kilometers long and 300 meters wide at its narrowest point. Hostile forces occupy the high ground on both sides. As the colonel outlined the tactical situation, Voss felt the familiar burn of exclusion. She had more combat hours than half the men in that room combined, had pulled off extractions that were whispered about in pilot-ready rooms from Bagram to Balad. But her personnel file carried a notation that followed her like a shadow. Disciplinary action, February 15, 2019. Insubordination during combat operations. The truth was more complex, as it always was, but complexity didn't fit neatly into official reports. The irony wasn't lost on her. 3 years ago, she had saved 17 Marines from a similar canyon, flying her Black Hawk through a gauntlet of rocket-propelled grenades and small arms fire, while her crew chief bled out in the cabin behind her. The Distinguished Flying Cross that followed had been a bittersweet victory, recognition, paired with the unspoken understanding that she would never again be trusted with the missions that mattered most. Now, watching the mission brief unfold without her, Voss felt the weight of that February day pressing down like the heavy air before a thunderstorm. She had made a choice then, one that saved lives but cost her everything else. The pilots receiving their orders today were good men, competent aviators who had earned their place through skill and dedication. But as Reed outlined the treacherous approach through the canyon's mouth, she knew with crystalline certainty that some of them wouldn't be coming home. The briefing continued with mechanical precision, call signs assigned, frequencies distributed, contingency plans outlined with the clinical detachment of men who had learned to compartmentalize fear. But in the back of the room, Nightshade felt the familiar tightening in her chest that came before every mission, the cocktail of adrenaline, responsibility, and something deeper that she had never been able to name. The other pilots filed out with their mission folders, their conversations already turning to pre-flight checks and fuel calculations. None of them looked back at the woman who had once been their equal, now reduced to an observer in her own war. As the room emptied, Voss remained in her chair, staring at the tactical display that still showed the canyon's unforgiving geometry. The green lines and elevation markers couldn't capture the reality of what awaited those pilots, the way the mountain walls would channel and amplify the sound of rotors, making stealth impossible. They couldn't show how the afternoon thermals would create unpredictable downdrafts, or how the insurgents had learned to use the canyon's acoustics to coordinate their ambushes. Reed lingered at the podium, gathering his papers with the deliberate movements of a man uncomfortable with his own decisions. When he finally looked up, his eyes met Voss's across the empty room, and for a moment, something passed between them, a shared understanding of the choices that define a military career. He opened his mouth as if to speak, then closed it and walked away, leaving her alone with the ghosts of missions past and the certainty that this one would join them. The tactical display flickered and went dark, but the canyon's image remained burned into Voss's retinas. She had flown that terrain before, not on any official mission but during her own reconnaissance flights, learning every ridge and outcropping the way a musician learns scales. She knew where the dead zones were, where the radar couldn't penetrate, where a skilled pilot might find the impossible approach that could save lives. But that knowledge, like everything else she had earned through blood and sacrifice, was locked away behind the barriers of regulation and mistrust. Outside, the sound of rotor blades began to build as the selected pilots began their pre-flight procedures. Voss finally stood, her joints protesting after 3 hours in the uncomfortable metal chair, and walked to the window. The 12 Black Hawks sat in perfect formation on the tarmac, their crews moving with the practiced choreography of professional warriors. She knew most of these men, had flown with them, trained with them, shared the unspoken bonds forged in combat. But today, she was just another face in the crowd, another pilot who had been found wanting when the mission demanded excellence. Major Jake "Ripper" Morrison emerged from the lead aircraft, his helmet tucked under his arm as he conferred with his crew chief. He was a good pilot, aggressive and skilled, but he favored power over finesse, overwhelming obstacles rather than dancing around them. In the open deserts of Afghanistan, that approach had served him well. But the canyon would not yield to brute force. It would demand something more subtle, more precise. Something that Morrison, for all his competence, had never learned to provide. The mission launch was scheduled for 1400 hours, when the sun would be at its zenith and the thermal conditions most challenging. It was a detail that made Voss's stomach clench with recognition. She knew that canyon, knew how the heat would rise from the rocks in shimmering waves that would distort targeting systems and create false horizons. The insurgents knew it too, which was why they had chosen this particular killing ground for their ambush. As she watched the final preparations, Voss felt the familiar weight of helplessness that had become her constant companion. She had the skills, the experience, the intuitive understanding of her aircraft that came from 15 years of pushing the boundaries of what was possible. But she also had the notation in her file, the black mark that followed her like a curse. The system that had created her had also caged her, and now she could only watch as others flew into danger she might have helped them avoid. The first Black Hawk lifted off at exactly 1400 hours, its rotor wash sending dust devils across the landing zone. One by one, the others followed, forming up in the tactical formation that would carry them north toward the canyon. Voss watched until they disappeared into the haze, then turned away from the window. She had her own aircraft to maintain, her own preparations to make for the routine supply runs that had become her punishment. But as she walked toward the hangar, she couldn't shake the feeling that this mission would be different, that the canyon would claim its due in ways that no briefing could anticipate. The afternoon sun beat down on the concrete with merciless intensity, and Voss pulled her flight cap lower over her eyes. In 6 hours, those 12 aircraft would either return in triumph or become the subject of another memorial service in the base chapel. She had attended too many of those services, had watched too many flag-draped coffins loaded onto transport aircraft bound for Dover. The faces changed, but the grief remained constant, a weight that every combat pilot carried but rarely acknowledged. Her own Black Hawk sat in the maintenance hangar, its engines silent but ready. Chief Warrant Officer Miguel Santos looked up from the daily inspection checklist as she approached, his weathered face showing the respect that enlisted personnel still accorded her despite her official status. "Afternoon, Captain. Birds ready for the 1800 supply run to Firebase Echo." His voice carried no judgment, no acknowledgement of the gulf between her past and present. In the hangar, competence still mattered more than politics. "Thanks, Chief." Voss ran her hand along the aircraft's fuselage, feeling the familiar texture of metal and composite materials that had become as familiar as her own skin. This particular Black Hawk had been with her for 2 years, had carried her through the routine missions that comprised her exile. It wasn't the newest bird in the fleet, didn't have all the latest upgrades, but it was hers in the way that mattered. Intimate knowledge of every system, every quirk, every capability that the technical manuals couldn't capture. Santos handed her the inspection sheet, their fingers brushing briefly in a gesture that somehow conveyed solidarity. Engines are running smooth. Hydraulics are good, all systems green. He paused, then added quietly, "Radio's been acting up on channel 7, but I think it's just the frequency selector. Might want to check it before you launch." Channel 7 was the command frequency for Operation Shadowfall. The implication hung in the air between them, unspoken but understood. Santos had served with her long enough to know that she would be monitoring the mission, listening to the radio chatter that would tell the story of success or failure. It was a small rebellion, a way of keeping her connected to the war from which she had been officially excluded. The supply run to Firebase Echo was a routine mission, a 40-minute flight through uncontested airspace to deliver mail, medical supplies, and fresh rations to a forward position. It was the kind of assignment given to pilots who needed to maintain their flight hours but couldn't be trusted with anything more significant. Voss had flown it 17 times in the past 2 months, knew every landmark, every navigation checkpoint, every radio frequency required for the transit. But today, it would serve a different purpose. Firebase Echo sat on a ridgeline 20 kilometers southwest of the canyon, where the reconnaissance team was trapped. From there, she would have a clear view of the target area, would be able to monitor the rescue mission without violating any direct orders. It was a distinction that might save careers if questions were asked later, but Voss knew it was more about maintaining the fiction of regulations than enforcing them. Everyone understood that some rules were meant to be bent, especially when lives hung in the balance. The pre-flight inspection took longer than usual, not because anything was wrong, but because Voss needed the ritual of checking systems and verifying readiness. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, but her mind was 20 kilometers away, visualizing the canyon's treacherous geometry and the challenges that awaited Morrison's formation. She had studied the terrain during her off-duty hours, had analyzed the intelligence reports that trickled down through official channels. The picture they painted was grimmer than anything shared in the morning briefing. The insurgents had been using the canyon for months, had turned it into a carefully orchestrated kill zone. They knew exactly where the rescue helicopters would have to approach, knew the limitations of the aircraft and the tactics that NATO forces would employ. More importantly, they had learned from previous engagements, had adapted their methods to exploit the weaknesses in coalition air operations. The reconnaissance team had walked into a trap, and now 12 Black Hawks were flying toward the same carefully prepared ambush. At 17:30 hours, Voss began her engine start sequence. The twin turbines wound up with their familiar whine, a sound that had become as comforting as a mother's heartbeat. Santos gave her the thumbs up from his position beside the aircraft, then stepped back as she engaged the rotors. The Black Hawk lifted off smoothly, responding to her touch with the precision that came from countless hours of shared flight time. The route to Firebase Echo took her west across the broken terrain of the Afghan mountains, a landscape that had humbled armies for centuries. From the cockpit, she could see the evidence of ongoing conflict. The blackened circles where improvised explosive devices had detonated, the abandoned compounds that had once housed coalition forces, the roads that were no longer safe for ground convoys. It was a reminder that this war had no clear front lines, no safe zones where the enemy's reach could not extend. As she flew, Voss monitored the radio traffic from Operation Shadowfall. The 12 aircraft had formed up as planned, were proceeding north toward the canyon under Morrison's command. Their communications were crisp and professional, the kind of radio discipline that came from extensive training and experience. But beneath the surface competence, she could hear the tension that always preceded combat operations, the slight hesitation before acknowledging orders, the clipped responses that betrayed underlying stress. Shadowfall 1. This is Overwatch. Target area is still quiet. No movement detected on thermal imaging. The voice belonged to Lieutenant Colonel Patricia Hayes, the operations officer who was coordinating the mission from the Tactical Operations Center. Her words carried the authority of someone who had spent years managing complex operations, but also the concern of a commander who knew that quiet could be more dangerous than chaos. Morrison's response came through clearly on the radio. Overwatch, Shadowfall 1. Understand target area quiet. Maintaining approach vector. Estimate 5 minutes to initial point. His voice carried the confidence that had made him the mission commander, but Voss detected something else, a subtle tightness that suggested he was already feeling the weight of responsibility that came with leading men into danger. The canyon was a 40-minute flight from their current position, but those 40 minutes would pass with agonizing slowness. Voss knew from experience that the waiting was often worse than the actual combat, that the anticipation could be more exhausting than the physical demands of flying in a hostile environment. The pilots would be checking their instruments repeatedly, verifying their weapon systems, running through contingency procedures that might mean the difference between life and death. Firebase Echo appeared ahead, its sandbagged perimeter and communications towers marking another small outpost in the coalition's far-flung network. The landing zone was a circle of packed earth surrounded by concrete barriers, designed to provide protection from indirect fire while allowing helicopters to land and take off. As Voss approached, she could see the soldiers gathering to unload the supplies she carried, their movements betraying the casual efficiency of men who had done this hundreds of times before. The landing was routine, but as she settled the Black Hawk onto the ground, Voss felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that came with any approach to a forward position. Firebase Echo had been mortared 3 times in the past month, had lost 2 soldiers to a sniper who had never been found. The war was everywhere, even in the moments that seemed peaceful, even in the routine operations that kept the coalition forces functioning. Staff Sergeant David Kim approached the aircraft as she shut down the engines, his face showing the weariness that came from months of continuous operations. "Afternoon, Captain. Got some fresh intel for you if you're interested." He glanced around to ensure they weren't overheard, then leaned closer. "Word is the reconnaissance team walked into something big. Locals are saying the whole valley is crawling with fighters who have been waiting for something like this." The information wasn't official, wasn't something that would appear in any intelligence report, but it carried the weight of truth that came from soldiers who lived on the ground. Kim had been at Firebase Echo for 8 months, had developed the network of contacts and sources that provided the kind of tactical intelligence that could mean the difference between success and disaster. His words confirmed what Voss had suspected. Operation Shadowfall was flying into a carefully prepared trap. "How many fighters?" she asked, her voice carefully neutral. Officially, she had no need to know this information, but the boundaries between official and unofficial intelligence had always been fluid in combat zones. "Hard to say for certain, but our contacts think maybe 200, maybe more. They've been moving into position for the past week, bringing in heavy weapons and communications gear. This isn't some opportunistic ambush. They've been planning this for months." Kim's expression was grim as he continued. "The locals are scared, Captain. They're staying inside, keeping their kids close. That's usually a pretty good indicator that something bad is coming." 200 fighters represented a significant force, larger than anything the intelligence briefings had suggested. If Kim's sources were accurate, Morrison's 12 aircraft were flying into a battle that would test every skill they had developed, every lesson they had learned in their years of combat service. The canyon that already presented significant tactical challenges was now revealed as a carefully orchestrated killing ground, designed to exploit the vulnerabilities of rescue operations. Voss helped the soldiers unload the supplies, her movements automatic while her mind processed the implications of Kim's intelligence. The reconnaissance team had been bait, whether they knew it or not, designed to draw coalition forces into the canyon, where superior numbers and intimate knowledge of the terrain would negate the technological advantages of the Black Hawks. It was a trap that showed sophisticated planning and patience, the kind of enemy adaptation that had made this war so difficult to win. The radio crackled with an update from Morrison's formation. "Overwatch, Shadowfall 1, approaching initial point, beginning descent for target area reconnaissance." The words carried the weight of commitment, the point of no return where the mission would either succeed or become another tragedy in the long catalog of failed operations. From Firebase Echo's elevated position, Voss could see the canyon in the distance, a dark line carved into the mountains that seemed to swallow light itself. The afternoon sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon, creating the kind of harsh shadows that would make target identification difficult and provide perfect concealment for waiting insurgents. The timing was deliberate, chosen to maximize the disadvantages faced by the rescue force. Lieutenant Marcus Webb, the firebase commander, approached as the last of the supplies were secured. His face showed the strain of commanding an isolated outpost, the weight of responsibility for 60 soldiers who depended on his decisions for their survival. "Captain, we've got a good view of the target area from our observation post. If you want to monitor the operation, you're welcome to use our communications setup." The invitation was carefully worded, offering access without implying any official sanction. Webb understood the complexities of military hierarchy, knew that Voss's presence here was both routine and potentially significant. By offering the use of their communications equipment, he was acknowledging her expertise while maintaining the fiction that she was simply a supply pilot with no official role in the ongoing operation. "I'd appreciate that, Lieutenant. Just want to make sure our people come home safely." The words carried layers of meaning, acknowledgement of the bonds that connected all coalition forces regardless of their specific assignments. Webb nodded and led her toward the command bunker, a reinforced structure that housed the fire base's communications and intelligence capabilities. The bunker was cramped and warm, filled with the electronic hum of radio equipment and computer systems. Sergeant First Class Maria Rodriguez looked up from her position at the communications console, her headset hanging around her neck. "Captain, we've got full spectrum monitoring of the operation. Command frequency is on speaker 1, tactical coordination on speaker 2. If you want to listen in, just grab a headset from the rack." The invitation felt like a homecoming, a return to the world of tactical operations from which she had been exiled. Voss selected a headset and plugged into the console, immediately immersing herself in the flow of radio traffic that told the story of 12 helicopters approaching their date with destiny. The voices were familiar, pilots and crew chiefs she had served with, men whose strengths and weaknesses she knew as well as her own. "Shadowfall 2, this is Shadowfall 1. Maintain spacing. We're getting some updrafts as we approach the ridgeline." Morrison's voice carried the calm authority of a mission commander, but Voss could hear the subtle changes in tone that indicated he was already feeling the effects of the canyon's treacherous weather patterns. The tactical display in the bunker showed the formation's progress, 12 blue icons moving steadily toward the red outline that marked the canyon's boundaries. But the display couldn't capture the reality of what those pilots were experiencing. The way the mountains seemed to close in around them, the sense of being watched from every ridge and outcropping, the growing certainty that they were flying into something far more dangerous than any briefing had suggested. Overwatch Shadowfall 1. Beginning approach to target area. Request final weather and threat assessment. Morrison's request was standard procedure, but the timing suggested he was already encountering conditions that differed from the briefing predictions. Hayes's response came through clearly. Shadowfall 1, Overwatch. Weather shows increasing winds from the northeast, gusting to 35 knots. Threat assessment remains moderate to high, with particular emphasis on small arms and rocket-propelled grenades from elevated positions. The weather report was worse than expected, and Voss felt her stomach tighten with recognition. 35-knot winds in the canyon would create unpredictable turbulence, would make precise flying nearly impossible. The pilots would be fighting their aircraft just to maintain formation, their attention divided between navigation and aircraft control at precisely the moment when they needed to be most focused on the tactical situation. But it was the threat assessment that truly concerned her. Moderate to high was military speak for "we know they're there, but we don't know how many or what they have." The emphasis on elevated positions confirmed Kim's intelligence about the preparation that had gone into this ambush. The insurgents had chosen their ground carefully, had positioned themselves to exploit every advantage the terrain provided. Shadowfall flight, this is Shadowfall 1. Switching to tactical frequency, maintain formation discipline. We're going in. Morrison's words marked the transition from approach to engagement, the moment when the mission would either succeed or become another lesson in the limits of air power. The tactical frequency crackled to life with the controlled chaos of a combat operation. Voices overlapped as pilots reported their positions. Crew chiefs called out potential threats, and the formation began its descent into the canyon. Voss found herself leaning forward, her hands unconsciously moving as if she were still flying, muscle memory, responding to the familiar rhythms of aerial combat. Contact left. Small arms fire from the ridgeline. The voice belonged to Chief Warrant Officer 3 Tommy Bulldog Martinez, Morrison's wingman. His call was followed immediately by the distinctive sound of return fire, the heavy chatter of door-mounted machine guns responding to the threat. The ambush had begun exactly as Voss had feared, with the insurgents opening fire from concealed positions on the canyon walls. The Black Hawks were trapped in a narrow corridor with limited room to maneuver, forced to run a gauntlet of carefully positioned weapons that could engage them from multiple directions simultaneously. It was every pilot's nightmare, the kind of situation that tested not just skill, but courage and the ability to make split-second decisions under fire. Shadowfall 1, taking fire from multiple positions. Request immediate air support. Morrison's voice had lost its earlier calm, replaced by the urgent tones of a commander who suddenly understood the true nature of the threat he faced. But air support was 20 minutes away, and the canyon's narrow confines made close air support nearly impossible without risking the helicopters already engaged in the rescue attempt. The formation was on its own, forced to fight its way through the ambush using only the weapons they carried and the skills they had developed over years of combat flying. Shadowfall 4 is hit, losing hydraulic pressure, attempting emergency landing. The call came from Captain Lisa Phoenix Chen, one of the youngest pilots in the formation. Her voice carried the controlled panic of someone dealing with a catastrophic system failure while under fire, the kind of situation that could quickly escalate from dangerous to deadly. Voss felt her heart racing as she listened to the tactical situation deteriorate. Chen was a competent pilot, but she lacked the experience needed to handle a hydraulic failure in combat conditions. The emergency landing procedures she had practiced in training were designed for controlled environments, not for canyon floors swept by hostile fire and littered with obstacles that could destroy an aircraft on contact. "Phoenix, this is Ripper. I've got you covered. Bring her down easy." Morrison's voice carried the confidence of a leader taking responsibility for his people, but Voss could hear the strain beneath the surface. He was trying to coordinate a rescue operation while managing a tactical emergency, the kind of multitasking that pushed even experienced pilots to their limits. The sound of Chen's aircraft hitting the canyon floor came through the radio as a series of metallic crashes and grinding noises that made everyone in the bunker wince. Emergency landings were always violent affairs, but this one sounded particularly brutal, the kind of impact that could cause serious injuries even if the aircraft remained relatively intact. "Shadowfall 4 is down. Crew is alive, but we've got wounded. Need immediate extraction." Chen's voice was shaky but determined, the voice of someone who had survived the first crisis but knew that more challenges lay ahead. The tactical situation had become exponentially more complex. Instead of extracting one reconnaissance team, Morrison's formation now had to rescue both the original objective and the crew of a downed helicopter. The canyon that had been designed as a trap for one aircraft now held two, with the insurgents undoubtedly moving to exploit this unexpected opportunity. "All Shadowfall elements, this is Shadowfall 1. Establishing defensive perimeter around Shadowfall 4. Shadowfall 2 and 3 continue to primary objective. We're not leaving anyone behind." Morrison's decision reflected the ethos that defined military aviation, the absolute commitment to recovering every member of the team regardless of the cost. But Voss knew that the decision, while morally correct, would stretch the formation's resources to the breaking point. The canyon's narrow confines meant that only a limited number of aircraft could operate effectively at any given time, and the need to protect Chen's downed helicopter would reduce the resources available for the original rescue mission. Shadowfall 2, approaching target area. Visual contact with reconnaissance team. They're in a defensive position about 200 meters from our planned landing zone. The voice belonged to Chief Warrant Officer 4 Anthony Spade Washington, Morrison's most experienced pilot. His calm professionalism was reassuring, but Voss could hear the tension that came from operating in a hostile environment with limited options. The reconnaissance team's position was worse than expected, pinned down in a location that would make extraction difficult under the best circumstances. With the canyon now swarming with insurgents drawn by the sound of combat, the rescue attempt would require precision flying and split-second timing that left no room for error. Spade, this is Overwatch. Be advised, we're seeing increased activity throughout the target area. Estimate 40 to 50 fighters moving toward your position. Hayes's warning came through clearly, but the numbers were far lower than the intelligence Kim had provided. Either the enemy was holding forces in reserve, or the surveillance systems were missing the true scope of the threat. Voss found herself gripping the headset with white knuckles, her body responding to the stress of listening to friends and colleagues fighting for their lives. The tactical situation was deteriorating rapidly, with multiple aircraft now committed to actions that would be difficult to reverse. The canyon had become a killing ground, exactly as the insurgents had planned. Taking heavy fire from the eastern wall, Shadowfall 6 is hit, losing altitude. The call came from Captain Robert "Hawk" Thompson, another experienced pilot who had been providing cover for the extraction attempt. His voice carried the controlled urgency of someone dealing with a critical aircraft malfunction while under fire. The radio exploded with overlapping transmissions as the formation tried to coordinate support for Thompson's damaged aircraft. The canyon's acoustics made communication difficult, with the sound of rotor blades and gunfire creating a cacophony that threatened to overwhelm the radio nets. Voss could hear the frustration in the pilots' voices as they struggled to maintain coordination in an environment that seemed designed to prevent it. Lieutenant Webb leaned over the console, his face grim as he processed the tactical updates. "Captain, this is turning into a disaster. They're getting chewed up in there, and we don't have the resources to support them adequately." His assessment was brutally honest, the kind of battlefield reality that commanders had to face when operations went wrong. But Voss was already thinking beyond the immediate crisis, her mind processing the tactical situation with the instinctive understanding that came from years of combat experience. The canyon had multiple approaches, including several that hadn't been covered in the morning briefing. She knew them because she had flown them during her unauthorized reconnaissance flights, had mapped the terrain with the kind of detail that came from personal exploration rather than satellite imagery. "Lieutenant, I need to see your tactical display." Can you overlay the canyon approaches on the current aircraft positions? Her request was carefully neutral, but Webb understood the implications. He nodded and began manipulating the controls, bringing up a detailed map that showed the canyon's complex geometry. The display confirmed what Voss had suspected. Morrison's formation was trapped in the main approach, the most obvious route that the insurgents had undoubtedly prepared for. But there were other options, narrow passages that could provide access to the canyon floor while avoiding the main killing zones. They were dangerous approaches, requiring precise flying and intimate knowledge of the terrain, but they offered the possibility of breaking the tactical stalemate. Shadowfall 1, this is Overwatch. Be advised, we're tracking approximately 150 fighters converging on your position. Recommend immediate withdrawal to alternate extraction point. Hayes's voice carried the authority of someone who had seen enough failed operations to recognize when it was time to cut losses. But Morrison's response reflected the dilemma that faced every combat commander. Overwatch, Shadowfall 1, negative on withdrawal. We have people on the ground and we're not leaving without them. Request immediate air support and reinforcements. The response was predictable, driven by the warrior ethos that had shaped Morrison's career. But Voss knew that courage alone wouldn't be enough to overcome the tactical realities of the canyon. The insurgents had chosen their ground well, had created a situation where conventional tactics would result in heavy casualties without achieving the mission objectives. Captain, you know that terrain better than anyone. Webb's words were carefully spoken, but they carried the weight of a request that couldn't be made officially. Is there anything you can tell us that might help those pilots? The question hung in the air like smoke from a brush fire, dangerous and potentially career-ending. Voss understood what Webb was asking, knew that any response would violate the boundaries that had been established after her disciplinary action. But she also knew that 12 aircraft full of skilled pilots and crew members were fighting for their lives in a canyon that she understood better than anyone else in the theater. There's a northern approach, a narrow passage that connects to the main canyon about 500 meters from where the reconnaissance team is positioned. Her words came out in a rush, the professional assessment overriding the personal considerations that should have kept her silent. It's not on any of the standard maps, but it's flyable for someone with the right experience. Webb nodded and began marking the route on his tactical display, his movements quick and efficient. The northern approach was indeed narrow, barely wide enough for a single helicopter, but it offered the possibility of reaching the trapped personnel while avoiding the main ambush zone. It was the kind of tactical option that could change the outcome of the entire operation. How do we get this information to Morrison? Webb asked, his voice carrying the urgency of someone who understood that time was running out. The question exposed the fundamental problem with Voss's situation. She had the knowledge that could save lives, but she lacked the authority to share it through official channels. Any attempt to communicate directly with the rescue formation would be seen as insubordination, would result in the kind of disciplinary action that could end her career permanently. "I can't," she said quietly, the words carrying the weight of all the compromises that had brought her to this moment. "But you can. Tell them the intelligence came from local sources, from someone who knows the terrain intimately." Webb understood the implications, knew that he was being asked to bend the truth in service of a larger goal. His decision came quickly, driven by the same warrior ethos that had motivated Morrison's refusal to abandon the mission. He reached for the radio handset, his voice carrying the authority of a Firebase commander sharing tactical intelligence. "Overwatch, this is Firebase Echo. We have local intelligence indicating a possible alternate approach to the target area. Northern Passage, approximately 2 kilometers from the main canyon entrance. Route is narrow but potentially flyable for experienced pilots." The response came back immediately. "Firebase Echo, Overwatch. Stand by for route coordination. We're passing this information to Shadowfall 1 immediately." The radio crackled with new activity as Hayes relayed the information to Morrison's formation. Voss felt her heart racing as she listened to the tactical discussion, knowing that her knowledge was now being used to modify the mission in real time. It was a strange sensation, being both connected to and isolated from the operation that was unfolding. "Shadowfall 1, this is Overwatch. We have information on an alternate approach that might allow you to reach the objective while avoiding the main ambush zone. Are you prepared to copy route details?" Hayes's voice carried the hope that came with new options, the possibility that the mission might still be salvaged. Morrison's response was immediate. "Overwatch Shadowfall 1, send it. We'll try anything at this point." The route description that followed was detailed and precise, based on Voss's intimate knowledge of the canyon's hidden passages. She found herself holding her breath as Hayes transmitted the navigation points, the elevation changes, the hazards that would have to be avoided. It was her route, her knowledge, being used to guide pilots she had trained and flown with into a tactical situation that could determine the outcome of the entire operation. "Shadowfall 7, this is Shadowfall 1. You're our most experienced pilot with mountain flying. I need you to take the northern approach and see if you can reach the reconnaissance team from that direction." Morrison's voice carried the weight of command, but also the recognition that this mission would require skills that not every pilot possessed. The pilot selected for the alternate approach was Chief Warrant Officer 5 Michael "Ghost" Patterson, a veteran aviator with more than 20 years of experience in special operations. His voice came through the radio with the calm confidence of someone who had faced similar challenges before. Shadowfall 1 Ghost. Understand alternate approach. Beginning navigation to Northern Passage. Voss felt a mixture of pride and anxiety as she listened to Patterson begin his approach. He was one of the best pilots in the theater, someone whose skills were legendary among the aviation community. If anyone could navigate the narrow passage successfully, it would be Patterson. But she also knew that the route would test every skill he had developed, would require the kind of precision flying that left no room for error. Ghost, be advised the passage narrows to approximately 50 meters at its tightest point. Recommend minimum speed, maximum concentration. Hayes's warning was based on the intelligence that had been passed through unofficial channels, but it carried the authority of someone who understood the tactical realities of the situation. The next few minutes passed in relative silence as Patterson navigated the treacherous approach. The radio carried only the routine communications of a pilot concentrating on his flying, the brief acknowledgments and position reports that indicated steady progress through dangerous terrain. But Voss knew that behind the calm professionalism, Patterson was dealing with wind shear, turbulence, and the constant threat of enemy fire from positions that hadn't been identified. Shadowfall 1 Ghost. I'm through the passage and have visual contact with the reconnaissance team. They're in bad shape, but they're still fighting. Beginning approach for extraction. Patterson's voice carried the relief of someone who had overcome the first major obstacle.